Have you ever reached a point in life where nothing looks completely wrong on the outside, and yet something inside you feels quietly unmoored, as if your days are moving forward while your spirit is standing still? There are seasons when people call this confusion, bad luck, burnout, or even a lack of discipline, but sometimes the deeper truth is far more intimate than that. Sometimes you do not feel lost because life has stopped speaking to you. Sometimes you feel lost because the noise inside you has become louder than the guidance trying to reach you. And if that resonates, then stay with me all the way through this video, because what we are about to explore may help you understand why your path has felt blurred, why your inner compass has seemed unreliable, and why the silence you have feared may not be silence at all. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what has felt most confusing in your life lately, because that one honest sentence may reveal more than years of overthinking ever could. Dr. Joe Dispenza often returns to one powerful idea. If the body keeps reliving the emotional memory of the past, then the mind struggles to perceive a new future with clarity. That is where many people quietly suffer. They are not without desire, and they are not without intelligence, but they are living in a state of inner static, carrying old disappointment, unresolved grief, silent self-doubt, and the exhausting need to force an answer before they are ready to receive one. In this state, even genuine signs feel distant, because perception itself has become distorted. So this is not a conversation about blind positivity or spiritual performance. It is a conversation about reconnection, about the subtle difference between lacking answers and being misaligned with the level of consciousness that can finally recognize them. When the problem is not the absence of answers, but the excess of internal noise, there is a subtle kind of exhaustion that does not come from doing too much, but from carrying too much inside without realizing it. It feels like trying to listen to something important while standing in the middle of a crowded room where every voice competes for attention. In moments like this, people often believe they need clearer signs, louder guidance, or a more direct answer from life itself. But what if the real issue is not that life has gone silent, but that your inner world has become too loud to perceive what is already being offered? Most people do not notice how deeply their internal state shapes their perception of reality. Anxiety, for instance, does not only make you feel restless, it alters the way you interpret everything around you. It compresses time, making you feel as though something must be resolved immediately. It narrows attention, causing you to overlook possibilities that do not match your urgency. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to confuse intensity with clarity. The louder the inner tension, the more convincing it feels, even when it is leading you away from your own center. There is also the quiet influence of comparison, which often disguises itself as motivation. When your mind is constantly measuring your path against someone else's timeline, it creates a subtle but persistent dissonance. You begin to question your own rhythm, your own timing, your own unfolding, and in that state, even genuine intuition becomes difficult to trust because it does not arrive with the same urgency or external validation that comparison demands. It arrives quietly, almost gently, and that softness can feel unfamiliar to a mind that has grown used to pressure. Dr. Joe Dispenza speaks about the way repeated emotional states condition the body, turning feelings into patterns that operate below conscious awareness. Over time, the body becomes accustomed to certain emotional frequencies, even if they are uncomfortable. Stress, doubt, and restlessness can become familiar enough that they start to feel like normality. And when that happens, stillness can feel uncomfortable, almost threatening. Silence is no longer a place of clarity. It becomes a space the mind tries to escape as quickly as possible. This is where a deeper misunderstanding begins to take shape. Many people believe they are searching for direction, when in truth, they are searching for relief from their own internal pressure. And these are not the same thing. Direction emerges from alignment, from a state in which thought, emotion, and perception are not in conflict. Relief, on the other hand, often comes from distraction, from temporarily stepping away from the discomfort without actually resolving it. And when relief is mistaken for guidance, the cycle continues, because nothing fundamental has changed. There is a quiet signal that reveals when this misalignment is present. It appears in the form of constant second-guessing, in the inability to feel settled even after making a decision, in the persistent sense that something is missing without being able to name what it is. It is not a dramatic collapse. It is a subtle drift, a gradual distancing from your own internal coherence. And the more you try to fix it through force, through urgency, through overanalysis, the more distant that coherence can feel. Imagine a lake whose surface is continuously disturbed by wind. No matter how clear the water beneath may be, the surface cannot reflect anything accurately. The sky above could be open, expansive, and full of light, but the reflection will remain distorted as long as the surface is in constant motion. In the same way, your inner world does not need more information as much as it needs less disturbance. Clarity is not always something that arrives. Often it is something that reveals itself when interference subsides. What makes this difficult to accept is that the mind is trained to believe that more effort will produce better results. That if something is unclear, the solution must be to think harder, search more, push further. But there are moments in life where the opposite is true, where clarity is not the result of force, but of alignment, where understanding does not come from accumulation, but from refinement, and where the answers you are seeking are not distant, but simply obscured by the very patterns you have learned to rely on. This is the first shift that begins to change everything. Not the realization that you need more answers, but the recognition that you may already be surrounded by them, waiting for a quieter, more coherent version of you to finally notice. The emotional body anchored in the past and the silent distortion of perception, there are experiences that do not end when they are over. They remain, not as clear memories, but as emotional imprints that quietly shape how the present is interpreted. A disappointment that was never fully processed, a loss that was absorbed in silence, a moment of rejection that rewrote how safety is perceived. These do not disappear simply because time has passed. Instead, they settle into the body, becoming part of the lens through which life is experienced. And without conscious awareness, that lens begins to influence what feels possible, what feels threatening, and what feels real. In this state, the search for direction becomes more complex than it appears on the surface. It is not only about finding the right path, but about recognizing how much of the confusion is being generated internally. When the emotional body is still aligned with past experiences, it continues to expect similar outcomes, even when circumstances have changed. This creates a subtle but powerful tension between what is consciously desired and what is unconsciously anticipated. The mind may reach forward, imagining something new while the body quietly holds on to what is familiar, even if that familiarity is rooted in discomfort. Dr. Joe Dispenza often describes this dynamic as a form of emotional conditioning, where the body becomes so accustomed to certain feelings that it begins to seek them out as a way of maintaining identity. It is not a conscious choice, but a learned pattern. Over time, the body starts to believe that these recurring emotional states are part of who you are. And because of that, anything outside of those patterns can feel uncertain, unstable, or even unsafe. Change, in this context, is not just a new opportunity. It is a disruption of what the body has come to recognize as normal. This is why clarity can feel distant, even when the external conditions are favorable. The mind may interpret this as a lack of guidance, but the deeper reality is often a lack of internal coherence. When emotion and intention are not aligned, perception becomes fragmented. Signals that might otherwise feel meaningful are overlooked or dismissed, not because they are absent, but because they do not match the emotional expectation held within. The body filters reality in a way that reinforces what it already knows, and in doing so, it can obscure what is trying to emerge. There is also a quiet attachment to certain emotional states that is rarely acknowledged, not because they are pleasant, but because they are familiar. Stress, for instance, can create a sense of control through urgency. Doubt can create a form of protection by limiting risk. Even sadness can become a space of identity, a place where the self feels defined, even if it is constrained. These patterns do not persist because they are beneficial, but because they have been repeated enough to feel stable. And stability, even when it is limiting, can feel safer than the unknown. In many cases, the desire for a new direction is genuine, but it is layered over a deeper resistance that has not yet been understood. This resistance is not a failure of willpower. It is a reflection of how deeply the body has internalized past experiences. When the emotional system has been shaped by repetition, it does not easily release its patterns. It requires a shift not only in thought, but in how those thoughts are felt and embodied. Without that shift, the same cycles continue, even when new possibilities are present. Imagine trying to tune a radio that is already locked onto a familiar frequency. No matter how much you want to hear a different station, the signal will remain distorted until the dial itself is adjusted. In the same way, your perception of direction is influenced by the frequency your emotional body is holding. It is not that the signal is missing, but that it is being filtered through a pattern that no longer serves your current reality. This is where a deeper form of awareness begins to emerge. Not the awareness of external options, but the awareness of internal alignment. When you begin to recognize the patterns that shape your emotional responses, something subtle starts to shift. The past loses some of its grip, not because it is erased, but because it is no longer unconsciously directing your present. And in that space, perception becomes clearer, not through force, but through coherence. What once felt like a lack of answers begins to reveal itself as something else entirely, a misalignment that was never meant to trap you, but to show you where your attention had been anchored for too long. Why the search for signs often replaces true alignment? There is a moment in many inner journeys when the search itself becomes a subtle form of escape. It no longer feels like curiosity or openness, but something closer to urgency, as if meaning must be found quickly before something is lost. In this state, attention begins to scan everything for confirmation. Repeated numbers, unexpected coincidences, brief emotional surges. Each one is examined with intensity, not from a place of quiet recognition, but from a need to resolve uncertainty as soon as possible. And without noticing, the search for guidance turns into a continuous loop of interpretation. What makes this pattern difficult to recognize is that it often appears spiritual on the surface. It carries the language of connection, awareness, and intuition. Yet underneath, there is often a subtle tension, a pressure to decode every experience, as if life were constantly sending encrypted messages that must be understood immediately. This pressure changes the quality of perception. Instead of allowing meaning to emerge naturally, the mind begins to impose meaning in order to reduce discomfort. And when that happens, the boundary between intuition and projection becomes increasingly blurred. There is a difference between noticing a sign and needing a sign. One arises from presence, the other from internal fragmentation. When perception is grounded, recognition happens quietly, without urgency or force. It feels stable, even if it leads into the unknown. But when perception is driven by emotional restlessness, every signal becomes amplified, and yet none of them feel fully convincing. There is always a lingering doubt, a need for another confirmation, another indication, another layer of reassurance that never quite settles the inner tension. This dynamic is often reinforced by the way modern life conditions attention. Constant stimulation trains the mind to expect immediate responses. Notifications, rapid information, and endless streams of content create an environment where stillness feels unfamiliar. In such a context, the deeper forms of awareness, those that require patience, silence, and sustained attention, can feel inaccessible. The mind becomes efficient at reacting, but less capable of receiving. And in that state, even authentic moments of clarity can pass unnoticed, because they do not match the intensity the mind has grown accustomed to. Dr. Joe Dispenza's work points to the importance of coherence between thought and emotion, suggesting that clarity is not merely a cognitive process, but a physiological one. When the nervous system is in a state of imbalance, perception follows that imbalance. The body interprets signals through the lens of its current state, not through objective neutrality. This means that even when life presents a genuine opportunity or direction, it may not be recognized if it does not resonate with the emotional frequency being held internally. The signal is present, but the system is not tuned to receive it accurately. There is also a quiet misconception that more information leads to more clarity. In reality, there are moments when the opposite becomes true. The accumulation of perspectives, techniques, and interpretations can create a form of cognitive overload that fragments attention rather than focusing it. Each new idea introduces another possibility, another path, another angle to consider. And instead of moving closer to understanding, the mind becomes entangled in a web of options that all seem equally compelling and equally uncertain. In this state, the search becomes self-perpetuating. The more uncertain you feel, the more you seek. The more you seek, the more fragmented your attention becomes. And the more fragmented your attention, the harder it is to recognize anything with clarity. It is not that answers are absent, but that they are being approached from a state that cannot fully integrate them. The result is a cycle that feels active and engaged, yet leads to a persistent sense of stagnation. Imagine trying to hear a soft melody while constantly adjusting the volume knob in search of the perfect level. The movement itself prevents you from settling into the sound. In the same way, the continuous search for signs can prevent the deeper recognition that comes from stillness. Meaning does not always arrive as something to be chased. Sometimes it reveals itself when the compulsion to chase begins to dissolve. There is a quiet turning point when the focus shifts from seeking external confirmation to restoring internal coherence. It does not involve withdrawing from life, but engaging with it differently. Attention becomes less scattered, less reactive, more grounded in the present moment. And in that grounded state, perception changes. What once felt ambiguous begins to take shape, not because something new has appeared, but because the capacity to perceive it has become more refined. At that point, the relationship with signs changes entirely. They are no longer something to depend on, but something that naturally integrates into a broader sense of understanding. They do not carry the weight of decision-making on their own. Instead, they complement a deeper clarity that arises from within. And in that integration, the search begins to soften, giving way to a form of awareness that is quieter, more stable, and far less dependent on constant validation. A quiet reconstruction of inner coherence and the return of direction. There is a phase in the process of realignment that does not feel like progress in the conventional sense. It does not come with sudden clarity or immediate certainty. Instead, it begins almost imperceptibly, like a subtle shift in the way attention rests within the present moment. The urgency that once dominated the mind starts to lose its intensity, not because every question has been answered, but because the need to resolve everything at once begins to soften. In this quieter space, something fundamental starts to reorganize itself. This shift is not about adopting new beliefs or collecting new techniques. It is about restoring coherence between what is thought, what is felt, and what is perceived. When these elements are fragmented, life feels disjointed, as if each decision is made in isolation without a deeper sense of continuity. But when coherence begins to return, even gradually, there is a subtle sense of alignment that emerges. Thoughts no longer contradict emotions as intensely, and perception becomes less reactive, more stable, more grounded. What is often overlooked is how much of this process unfolds beneath conscious awareness. The nervous system, which has been conditioned by repetition, begins to recalibrate when it is no longer constantly stimulated or overwhelmed. This does not happen through force. It happens through a gradual reduction of internal friction. As the body experiences moments of genuine stillness, even brief ones, it starts to recognize a different baseline, a state that is not defined by urgency, but by presence. And from that presence, perception begins to change. Dr. Joe Dispenza's perspective on emotional conditioning offers an important insight here. When the body is no longer trapped in familiar stress responses, it becomes more receptive to new patterns of experience. This receptivity is not dramatic. It does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself through small but meaningful shifts, a decision that feels less conflicted, a moment of clarity that arises without effort, a sense of ease where there was once tension. These are not random occurrences. They are indicators that coherence is being restored. There is also a change in how uncertainty is experienced. Previously, uncertainty may have felt like something to escape, something that needed to be resolved immediately in order to regain a sense of control. But as alignment deepens, uncertainty begins to lose its threatening quality. It becomes part of the unfolding, not an obstacle to it. This does not mean that all doubts disappear, but they no longer dominate the internal landscape. They exist alongside a growing sense of stability that is not dependent on having all the answers. In this state, direction does not appear as a single, definitive path. It reveals itself through a series of subtle inclinations, moments where something feels slightly more aligned, slightly more coherent, even if it is not fully understood. These moments are easy to overlook if the mind is still searching for certainty in its most rigid form. But when attention becomes more refined, these small signals begin to carry meaning, not as commands, but as indications of resonance. Imagine walking through a landscape in the early morning when the light is soft and the air is still. The path is not marked with bold signs or clear instructions. Instead, it reveals itself gradually through the way the ground feels beneath your steps, through the direction of the light, through the quiet sense of where movement feels natural. This is how direction often returns when coherence is restored, not as something imposed from the outside, but as something that emerges from within the relationship between you and your environment. Another subtle transformation occurs in the relationship with time. The pressure to arrive somewhere quickly begins to loosen. There is a recognition, sometimes unspoken, that clarity cannot be forced into existence. It unfolds at the pace that alignment allows. And in that recognition, there is a release of tension that had previously gone unnoticed. The mind is no longer trying to compress the future into the present. It becomes more willing to remain where it is, to observe, to sense, to allow the next step to reveal itself without coercion. This does not mean passivity. It is not a withdrawal from life nor a surrender of agency. It is a different quality of engagement. Actions still occur, decisions are still made, but they arise from a place that feels internally consistent rather than externally pressured. There is less fragmentation, less second-guessing, less oscillation between extremes. And over time, this consistency begins to build a sense of trust, not in external outcomes, but in the internal process itself. As this process continues, something that once felt distant begins to feel accessible again. The sense of being guided, not by something external imposing direction, but by an internal coherence that aligns perception with possibility. What once appeared as silence reveals itself as subtle communication, not because the world has changed, but because the way it is being perceived has transformed. Direction, in this sense, is not something that arrives fully formed. It is something that becomes visible when the conditions within you are no longer obscuring it. The answer may already be present, but clarity emerges when inner coherence returns. There is a quiet truth that often reveals itself only after a long period of searching. The absence you once felt was not an absence of guidance, but a distance from your own internal alignment. What seemed like silence was, in many ways, a reflection of how fragmented the inner world had become. Thoughts pulling in one direction, emotions anchored in another, and perception caught between urgency and doubt. In that state, even the most genuine signals lose their clarity, not because they are weak, but because they are filtered through instability. As coherence begins to return, something subtle yet profound takes place. The need to force answers gradually dissolves, replaced by a deeper sense of trust in the unfolding process. This trust is not blind or passive. It is grounded in the recognition that clarity is not something to be chased, but something that emerges when the internal environment becomes stable enough to perceive it. The noise that once dominated begins to quiet, and within that quiet, perception refines itself naturally. Joe Dispenza's work reminds us that the body must learn to feel the future before the mind can clearly perceive it. This is not about imagination detached from reality, but about aligning emotional states with the possibility of something new. When the body is no longer conditioned to repeat the past, it becomes receptive to a different experience of the present. And in that receptivity, direction is no longer something distant or abstract. It becomes something tangible, felt in small decisions, subtle inclinations, and a growing sense of internal consistency. At this point, the idea of being lost begins to lose its meaning. What once felt like disorientation reveals itself as a necessary transition, a period where old patterns were dissolving before new coherence could take shape. And within that transition, there is a quiet intelligence at work, guiding not through force but through alignment. The path was never truly absent. It was simply waiting for you to become still enough to recognize it. Have you ever stopped to consider that the clarity you've been searching for might already be trying to reach you, but in a language you have not yet learned to hear? Take a moment and reflect on that. If this message resonated with you in any way, subscribe to the channel so you can continue deepening this level of awareness. And as this video comes to an end, allow yourself to keep exploring. There is another video on your screen right now that can help you continue this process of reconnection and inner alignment.